Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Hecklers Podcast. It's been a little while since we last checked in, but we're back, and with the regular season wrapped up, we have plenty to dive into. We'll save our playoff preview show for this Friday when my co host Billy will be returning to the pod. For today, I wanted to focus entirely on the reactions to head coaching vacancies around the league, what jobs are open, why they're open, and the state of each of these franchises they look for their next head coach. Black Monday was relatively quiet this year, with only one head coach being fired, that being Doug Peterson of the Jaguars. But of course, several other coaches were let go earlier in the season. And in the case of Gerard Mayo, his departure came shortly after the Patriots' final game. So we'll walk through each of these openings chronologically, starting with the Jets based on when they were fired. So, with that, the Jets entered the season with incredibly high expectations of a deep playoff run, having invested heavily in Aaron Rodgers to lead the team. So, after starting 2-0 against really the league's weaker teams, the Jets quickly slipped to 2-2 following really disappointing losses to the Broncos and Vikings, two teams which of course now we know are playoff teams. So as a result, Robert Saleh was actually fired on October 8th. He was the first head coach fired this year. So, the difficult thing here is the Jets, after going all in on Aaron Rodgers and ultimately falling short, really find themselves in the unenviable position of needing an initial. They really need to initiate a rebuild. So how difficult will that really be? Well, they have a solid stockpile of draft picks, 8 in total for this year. And they also have some young talent in Sauce Gardner, Breece Hall, and Garrett Wilson. So realistically, the toughest challenge for the Jets is going to be finding a quarterback for the future, but also managing Garrett Wilson's personality through this rebuild. He's been incredibly frustrated with the state of the team. So finding a way to get him back into the fold and back on track and continue to develop him into a star receiver is going to be really important for them. So overall, I think this is a decent job given the talent that's already on the roster and the draft assets that are available to sort of aid in that rebuilding process. But the Jets are going to need to hire themselves a team builder who can really capitalize on their draft picks and who can continue to add young talent to that roster. So ideally, this person would have the experience, they would have a strong coaching tree from which they could draw competent coordinators from. Some of the early names that I've seen floated for this opening are Ron Rivera, Mike Vrabel, both of whom fit kind of the mold of what we're talking about really well. It's also been reported that Rex Ryan will interview for the position. I'm not entirely sold on that one. I think that's more for nostalgia than it is sort of reacting to the situation they're in and truly choosing the best possible candidate. So ultimately, I sort of expect the Jets to hire an experienced coach with a strong reputation for building a winning culture and, of course, assembling a strong coaching staff. All right. So moving into our second job opening, the second job that became available this year is the Saints. The Saints have been stuck in sort of like this mediocrity for probably the past few years. And they were really struggling under Dennis Allen's leadership following Sean Payton's departure. We've seen the turnaround that he's had with the Broncos. Clearly, losing Sean Payton was a big deal for the Saints. So, like the Jets, though, the Saints, they started the season 2-0. Derek Carr was looking like an MVP caliber quarterback, but things quickly unraveled and they slipped to 2-5 and then ultimately fired Dennis Allen on November 4th. So, the Saints, they're in a tough position because they have a lot of expensive veteran contracts and they really have a lack of premier high end young talent. Chris Olave is probably the brightest spot on the roster, but a history of concussions could derail his career prematurely. Not to mention his own frustrations. We talked about Garrett Wilson, Chris Olave, frustrated in New Orleans, possibly wants out. So the next coach is going to have to deal with the challenges of turning over an aging, really expensive roster And that likely starts with moving Derek Carr in order to kickstart the rebuilding process. So, the team is going to have 6 picks in the upcoming draft, including a top 10 selection. But with the cap situation as it stands, this job is one of the least attractive jobs that's available because the roster is aging and there's really little to build on in the short term. And the incoming coach is going to need to be a really high level tactician who can scheme around a lack of talent and really make the most out of a depleted roster for at least a year or two. And given the state of their cap situation, the coach really probably won't need to handle personnel decisions. Like that needs to fall on an experienced front office staff who understands how to move contracts, to restructure contracts, and to draft well. So, what I'd really like to see is a coach with signs of growth in that first year. So similar to what we saw from the Panthers under Dave Canales this season, where sure the roster isn't great and the win-loss record isn't great, but what you saw was a team that started out awful and that towards the second half of the year started to string together some wins, started to be competitive, started to look like a competent football team to where you feel comfortable going forward with what you have. So for the Saints, they seem to agree with what I'm proposing here, as they've already requested interviews with offensive coordinators Kellen Moore and Joe Brady, two people who I think fit that mold of like promising, relatively promising. Kellen Moore's kind of been through it, and obviously Joe Brady had his struggles in Carolina, but like relatively promising young offensive coordinators. So you give one of these people the reins, and you let them coach an under talented team during a rebuild for a year, maybe 2 years, and you just see, do they show improvement? Do they show the ability to maximize what you're getting out of these players? Let's just take Joe Brady for example, right? Does Chris Olave just look amazing under him? Is the scheme good? Are you getting him the ball? Are you taking full advantage of somebody like Rashid Shaheed? If you're Kellen Moore, what is your relationship like with Spencer Rattler? Are you is he playing better under you than he would with somebody else, right? Like those are the things that I'd be looking for if I was the Saints, if I'm going to hire one of these guys. All right, next up is going to be the Chicago Bears. The Bears fired Matt Eberflus on November 29th after a 4-8 start to the season, with Caleb Williams drafted into what seemed like probably one of the best situations that a top pick has had in many years. Expectations were fairly high for this team. Early on, it seemed like the Bears could be a 500 team at worst, which I know we're sitting here, we're saying, well, 500 team, like that's not great. But at the end of the day, for a Bears team that's in an incredibly difficult division, like that would be a massive step up. And that would have been the type of progression that you were looking for to say that this is pointing in the right direction. But of course, that's not what happened. Things quickly fell apart. Williams regressed, and the team faltered across the board. Like everything came crumbling down. So the good news for the Bears, though, is that they have a strong draft position and they have a pretty strong roster as well. Pretty much all thanks to the Carolina Panthers. So they've got some talent on offense. They've got the picks that they need to improve both the offensive line and the defense, two areas that I think are very strong in this draft class. So I think the draft class really suits what this team needs. So as far as a coaching decision is concerned, I think what you're looking for are coaches who can develop Caleb Williams and really strengthen the roster, and that really comes through experienced coaches who understand how to relate to their players. So in this, I'm thinking about somebody like Pete Carroll, who for years in Seattle just seemed to understand his players and have really great relationships with them. And he had the right coaches under him that were kind of scheming up things offensively, defensively that were incredibly effective. So I think Pete Carroll, that type of culture is something that the Bears could really benefit from. And of course, Caleb Williams, he needs the freedom to be himself. Part of the reason that he was such a highly touted prospect is because of that sort of um, off off schedule creativity when a play breaks down his ability to do things and to take risks, and you don't want to lose that. And you need someone who can pull him back in when his risky play is starting to hurt the team, kind of like Andy Reid does with Patrick Mahomes. Where if your play starts to become a detriment to the team, I'm going to kind of pull you aside and we're going to simplify the offense and we're going to make things easy to move the ball downfield, and we're going to kind of get back in rhythm, and you can play hero ball when it's time to play hero ball. I think Brian Flores and Mike McCarthy are really great fits here, two guys that they have requested for interviews. So I'm really happy to see that. Honestly, though, the most Bears thing that they could do, however, would be to hire Arthur Smith, whom they've also requested to interview, and that would be a mistake in my opinion. His teams in Atlanta wasted plenty of talent that we've seen, even with decent coaching this year, and decent quarterback play has been unlocked with Drake London really bursting off the screen with his performance. So I think they can't go wrong with Brian Flores or Mike McCarthy. It does sound like, based on what I've seen, the Cowboys have yet to respond to their request to interview Mike McCarthy. So we'll have to kind of see how that shakes out. They may have to wait until he is. I think there's some kind of deadline in January where he's open to just start talking to teams. So they'll have to wait for that. So let's see. Next up is going to be my New England Patriots. This one, it's a tough pill for me to swallow as a Patriots fan. The Crafts, they had identified Gerard Mayo as Bill Belichick's eventual successor, and they even wrote it into his most recent coaching contract before becoming head coach. Um, Unfortunately, Belichick's decline it came sooner than I think the Crafts expected. I think they thought they would get through this year. He would have a chance to break the record, and then they would be able to move on to Gerard. But because things fell apart so rapidly, it sort of forced the Crafts to make a move ahead of their planned timeline. And Mayo was clearly underprepared. And with a really poorly constructed roster, the season just kind of quickly went off the rails. Some of the things that have been talked about in Patriot circles are the fact that Mayo lost the locker room. You had players like Demario Douglas, Jalen Polk, Keon White really publicly challenging him in the media. And this was supposed to be the strength of Gerard Mayo, was that he could relate to the players, that the players respected him and wanted to play for him. Well, clearly that wasn't what was happening. And he also, he had several unforced errors with the media during his really brief tenure where he was saying things that he shouldn't have said to the media. He was lying to the media. And it just became an adversarial relationship. And he was just sort of creating unnecessary problems for himself. And that really culminated in the final week of the season where he's telling everybody that Drake May will be the starter. And then and everyone's questioning like, why are you doing this? We need to lose this game. You can't risk Drake May's health. Why are you doing this? Why are you doing this? Well, then lo and behold, the game starts. Drake May plays a series and then is pulled from the game for Joe Milton. I don't know if he was trying to be like too cute by half and try to sort of catch the Bills off guard. Don't know why you would feel like you need to do that. Um, because the Bills were very open about, hey, Josh Allen's going to play one snap to maintain his record for starts, and then he's coming out, right? Like they didn't hide anything. I don't know why you felt like you needed to hide the fact that Drake May was just going to play a series. I think you could have avoided a lot of uncomfortable conversations with the media and a lot of trouble for yourself this past week if you had just been honest from the get go that it was Joe Milton who was going to play the majority of the game. So that's just kind of one example of where things got to at the end of the year. And then, this really, all of this sort of culminated in his firing less than 90 minutes after the Patriots' final game, which of course was a win against Buffalo that ironically cost us the first overall pick. So a nice little parting gift from Gerard Mayo for the Patriots. But he was clearly adversarial with the media after the game. Once it had become clear that he had lost his job, I think he sort of felt like the media played a pretty big role in that, and he chose violence with them in his post game press conference. So, as As for the state of the team, any incoming coach is going to have the opportunity to work with Drake May, which should be really enticing for offensive minded coaches. The defense, though sloppy under Mayo, has really talented players, guys like Kyle Duggar, Christian Gonzalez, and Christian Barrymore. Um, so the Patriots, they're planning to keep the front office intact, probably through the draft at least. Just because they've been working on this draft class all year, and you don't necessarily want to interrupt that process. So I think that's going to play a major role in the coaching search. It really does seem like a shotgun marriage between this front office and whoever the eventual coach is almost certain at this point. Something that has traditionally not worked out. Coaches typically like to bring their own general managers, people they know they're on the same page with and have a similar idea of how they want to construct a roster. So it's kind of interesting that the Patriots would choose to keep this group around, but we'll kind of see how that works out. Draft capital for the Patriots, they hold the fourth pick. There should be several quality prospects available at that point to fill positions that they need. Tet McMillan, wide receiver out of Arizona, Abdul Carter, pass rusher out of Penn State, kind of a more raw prospect. And then perhaps even Travis Hunter falls to them at that point, which they can certainly use help in the secondary, someone to play opposite Christian Gonzalez, but then also take advantage of Travis Hunter as a third down pass catcher for them to assist their horrible, horrible, horrible receiving room. So the tools are there to rebuild, but it's really going to be a matter of developing and adding talent. And that's going to take a certain kind of coach. And of course, the worst kept secret right now is Mike Vrabel's interest in the job and the Patriots' interest in him. They've requested and been granted an interview with Ben Johnson, which I think is just due diligence, but one that I'm grateful for nonetheless. I think they should talk to Ben Johnson and see, if he's interested in coaching Drake May and they like his vision for the team. Like, I don't think you necessarily have to hand this to Vrabel. That's what you did with Gerard Mayo. Like, I think conducting an actual search and you can come into it with Vrabel as the favorite, but if Ben Johnson blows you away and he wants to coach here, I think you have to consider it. I don't think you just hand it over to, whatever guy wore the Patriots uniform. So ultimately, Vrabel does seem like the clear choice. He'll need to be able to develop talent. He'll need to add to the roster and manage a locker room and honestly a fan base that's grown increasingly toxic and impatient with the team. Vrabel had success in Tennessee. Things fell apart towards the end when he disagreed with their decision to have Rand Carthen as the general manager, disagreed with the decision to send AJ Brown out of town. I think in retrospect, Vrabel looks better coming out of that, because quite honestly, he was right. And he made a lot with a not so great team. He was taking Ryan Tannehill to the playoffs and the 1 seed, and I think a chance to do that with Drake May is really interesting. And then the other thing I will say about Mike Vrabel before we move on to our last team, he has spent the year with the Browns, working in sort of a consultant role, but actually learning a lot about the offensive side of the ball. And then also, of course, the Browns are a data heavy organization, something the Patriots are most certainly not. It was basically Bill Belichick with a Ouija board trying to figure out who to draft. So I think, having this data approach and having exposure to now both sides of the football, a really robust coaching tree. He's been around a lot, and having a record of success. Vrabel is a great candidate, and I think they would be great to hire him. I think he makes a lot of sense, but I do think you need to do your due diligence. You need to check in on Ben Johnson. He's the hottest coach on the market for a reason. I think you got to talk to him. All right, moving into our last team. Finally, we get to the Jaguars, the only opening that came on Black Monday. The Jaguars situation is somewhat like the Jets, where they should have been competing with the Texans for control of the division, but instead they found themselves battling with the Titans at the bottom of the division. So, Doug Peterson, he was brought in to capitalize on Trevor Lawrence's rookie contract and really a weakened AFC South at that point. But since then, the division's gotten better and stronger with the emergence of CJ Stroud. And of course, Trevor Lawrence has signed a massive deal, consuming a larger portion of the team's cap space, making it harder to build around him. So, the Jags, though, all that said, they're still in a good position. They have a generational talent at quarterback. I know the results in the NFL have not necessarily jumped off the page, but uh, there is still a generational prospect in there. There is still talent in there. And it has shown at times that I think getting a more consistent version of Trevor Lawrence is going to go a long way for them. Brian Thomas Jr., who they took in the draft this past year, looks like a star receiver. And the defense has some really young prospects, guys that they've taken quite high in the draft over the last few years. So again, kind of unlocking the potential of a lot of these players. They also have a decent arsenal of draft picks, including multiple third and fourth round picks that should help them add depth across the board. Of course, in a running back heavy draft, you'll have an opportunity to take a running back because Travis Etienne, who was really once considered a promising prospect alongside Trevor Lawrence, really appears to have fallen off and doesn't seem like he's going to be an effective part of that team in the future. So, this team, it has talent and they have draft picks, but they're going to need a coach who can maximize what they've got. And the issue with this, however, is that the coach is going to have to work with Trent Baalke, the general manager, who really continues, in my opinion, to avoid accountability for his poor management of the team. So, whoever's going to be, so like you have to think about like who's going to be a good fit for this job, uh, knowing that they're going to be shackled by Baalke. The next coach, in my opinion, it's going to need to be somebody with a strong enough personality to where they can supersede Baalke and take full control over the decision making. They need to be sort of the final voice. They need to be the buck stops with them type of thing. So, I think the Jags are going to be tempted to chase Ben Johnson to try to fix their offensive woes and get the most out of Trevor Lawrence. But, Johnson doesn't really have the clout to push back against Baalke's bad decisions. And that's what I'd be worried about with a first time head coach. So based on their interview requests, it looks like they're leaning towards hiring a younger coordinator, which I really don't think will work. Personally, I like Robert Saleh, whom they've also requested to interview. I think he could be a really solid choice. I think he kind of learned in New York that he does need to have a thicker skin. He does need to stand up to ownership and stand up to his general manager and the players. I love him as a tactician coming from the Shanahan tree. I think he'll have access to offensive coordinators who can support him. Of course, defensively, I trust him to maximize that defense and get the most out of the players they've taken. But again, like with Robert Saleh, he's been through it where he's had a diva and Aaron Rodgers who was basically demanding the players that he would play with. He had ownership that was, so eager to win that they would force Aaron Rodgers on him. And I just think Robert Saleh as somebody who's been through it and hopefully has come out the other side a little bit more assertive and ready to push back against poor decision making, because I think that's what you worry about with Trent Baalke. Like this is, the Brian Thomas thing is great. Good pick, right? Like you're sitting there, they've got Calvin Ridley who's been paid, which again, you paid Calvin Ridley. Sorry, not Calvin Ridley. Christian Kirk. You paid Christian Kirk an absurd amount of money. You have Gabe Davis and you have Devin Duvernay. Like these are not great names, right? But credit to that team for saying we're going to take Brian Thomas because he's better than anybody we have on our roster at receiver, even if we've filled out the room and paid guys. So really, credit there. But outside of that, like these depth drafts, the pieces where you're finding guys who fill out your roster, right? What Bill Belichick was really good at, finding the Kyle Duggars, finding the Christian Barmores, the Ramondre Stevensons, right? Like that's not happening. Anyone can hit on a top 10 pick. What they can't do is they can't hit on those fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh round picks that fill out a roster. And that's really what separates the good from the bad GMs. And I think Baalke is a bad GM. So, keeping that in mind, I just think Go with somebody with experience. Go with somebody who can stand up to those bad decisions and ultimately say what needs to be said. So that's going to wrap up our analysis of the head coaching vacancies around the league. We'll be back on Friday with our playoff preview show, of course, with Billy. So looking forward to that. You won't want to miss it. Thank you as always for tuning in. We appreciate your support. Don't forget to follow the show, rate it, subscribe, do all the things to help us reach more folks. And we'll be back on Friday.